welcome to this deep dive into a really crucial question. How does Europe actually step up its game? We've got a fascinating collection of recent reports, economic data too, and it all seems to point towards one central theme.
Boosting competitiveness, right?
Yes.
Innovation, growth.
Exactly, and ultimately sparking more, happiness and optimism across the continent.
That's right. Think of this as your shortcut, really, to understanding the key challenges, but also the potential solutions for Europe.
And not just from the grand EU look.
No. We're looking at individual countries, the businesses actually operating here, and importantly, everyday Europeans.
It's a complex picture, isn't it? Geopolitics, trade issues, energy prices.
Yeah, all these things are swirling around, impacting Europe's economic standing.
Okay, let's try and unpack this, starting with the EU itself.
Makes sense.
Competitiveness seems to be right at the top of the agenda. The incoming European Commission, they're emphasizing reforms, investment in innovation, the green transition.
Strategic independence, too. Don't forget that.
Right. So what's really driving this renewed focus at the EU level?
Well, what's fascinating, or maybe worrying, is the persistent issue of productivity.
Productivity. Always comes back to that.
It does. The data, it consistently shows Europe's productivity growth hasn't really kept pace, especially if you look at the U.S.
And this gap isn't new, is it?
No, it's been widening, actually, since about the mid-1990s. And a big factor seems to be how quickly, or maybe how slowly, Europe has adopted and invested in ICT.
Information and communication technology.
Precisely.
But here's where it gets really interesting. It's not just about having the fastest computers or software, is it?
Not at all.
Our sources really hammer home the foundational role of institutions.
Yes, exactly. The rules of the game, formal and informal, the laws, the norms, they shape how businesses operate, how innovation happens or doesn't.
So strong, inclusive institutions, they create that environment where businesses feel confident to invest, to innovate.
That's the idea. But the reality in Europe is, it's complex. The regulatory landscape varies a lot between member states.
Right. I saw the EIB investment survey highlights regulations as a major hurdle.
It does, and the data really shows how different that burden can feel depending on which country you're in.
So different rules, different hoops to jump through everywhere.
Pretty much. And the IMF, they even put a number on it. They estimate these internal regulatory barriers add up to trade costs inside the EU that are like having a pretty hefty tariff, especially for manufacturing.
Wow. Okay, so if these differences are such a big barrier, what's the EU thinking? What's the way forward? Sounds like strengthening the single market is key.
Absolutely. Completing the single market, streamlining regulations, that's the goal.
Any specific ideas floating around?
Well, there's talk of things like a new business code, maybe specifically for innovative companies, trying to harmonize insolvency laws across countries too.
Okay.
And the new unitary patent system, that's definitely a positive step, makes patent protection cheaper and simpler across many EU countries.
Good.
And beyond that, there's this growing understanding that some things are just, they're essential public goods.
Like what?
Things like affordable, greener energy, breakthrough research, a really solid digital infrastructure, especially thinking about AI diffusion. These need coordinated EU-level action.
Okay, so let's zoom in a bit. From the EU level down to individual member countries, this varied regulatory landscape we mentioned, it must have real effects on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. The data is clear. Businesses face very different regulatory challenges depending on the country. But it's not just the rules themselves. It's also about the administrative capacity of each country.
You mean how well they can actually implement these big EU plans, like the Green Deal or the Digital Compass?
Exactly. We saw some challenges with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the RRF funds, getting the money out efficiently, using it effectively. It depends heavily on strong national administration.
And it's not just the business climate within these countries either, right? I saw some concerning things about education trends.
Yes, the PISA results. They show really significant differences in how well students are doing across the EU.
And some are actually declining.
Worryingly, yes, many have seen a decline. So that points to needing improvements in education systems, obviously, but also making it easier for qualifications to be recognized across borders. That was in the letter report.
Makes sense. Skills need to be portable.
Definitely. And then you've got the demographic challenge.
Aging populations, shrinking workforces in some places.
Right. So countries need policies to get more people, working women, older people, and also really well-designed immigration policies, smart ones.
And maybe technology can help too. Automation.
Potentially, yes.
Mhm.
Some research suggests investing in automation could help offset some of the productivity impacts of these demographic shifts.
And basic infrastructure, can't forget that. Roads, rail, internet.
Crucial. Significant national investment is needed there. Both physical infrastructure, like transport, and the data suggest we're a bit behind the US and Japan there. In digital infrastructure, high-speed internet, 5G rollout, that's still patchy. And the fact that national telecom markets are still quite fragmented doesn't help digital progress.
Right. Okay, let's shift perspective again. Think about the businesses actually based in Europe. What are their main headaches?
Well, one interesting concept is firm dynamism.
Firm dynamism. What's that exactly?
It's basically the churn rate, how quickly new businesses start up and how quickly unsuccessful ones close down.
Okay. And how does Europe compare?
It seems to be weaker here than in the US. Fewer new companies starting up. And maybe surprisingly, fewer businesses going bankrupt in the US context, suggesting maybe more dynamism there. And another related point, the average age of the top companies in Europe is actually increasing.
Which might mean?
Could be a sign of less intense competition, maybe not enough new players challenging the incumbents.
That makes sense. If you don't have that constant pressure from new, innovative firms.
Exactly. The established players might not feel they need to evolve as fast.
What about getting money? Funding challenges.
Ah, yes. That's a big one, especially for young, innovative, smaller companies.
Why is it harder for them here?
Several factors, it seems. Investors might be a bit more risk-averse, and these young firms often rely heavily on intangible assets, software, IP, brand value.
Harder to put on a balance sheet, harder to borrow against.
Kind of. It highlights the need for deeper capital markets in Europe, definitely more active venture capital.
Right.
And the data also shows Europe just invests a smaller slice of its GDP in things like ICT equipment and intellectual property compared to the US. That gap's been growing too.
Which leads to this idea of a middle technology trap.
Yeah, some analysts use that term. The idea is maybe Europe focuses too much on making small improvements to existing stuff rather than going for the really big game-changing innovations.
We keep coming back to regulations, too. Sounds like they're a particular problem for businesses trying to grow.
Absolutely. The regulatory burden, the inconsistencies across borders, it really limits the ability of EU companies to scale up, to get big enough to compete globally. Several reports highlight this.
So even if you have a great idea in one country, taking it across the EU is difficult.
It can be, yes. And while adopting digital tech offers huge potential productivity gains, the actual impact varies. It depends on having those efficient institutions we talked about, good governance, and crucially, a workforce with the right skills. Scaling up helps digitalization too.
Is there any good news on the innovation front?
Well, yes. On green innovation, Europe is actually doing pretty well currently.
Oh, despite lower overall R&D spending compared to the US and China.
Yeah, if you look at green patents, EU activity is comparable, though China is catching up incredibly fast.
So the potential is there.
The potential is definitely there. But the key is focusing not just on inventing green tech, but on patenting effectively, scaling it up quickly, and tackling that regulatory fragmentation so businesses can actually leverage the single market for clean tech.
And what else keeps European firms awake at night? Long-term barriers.
Surveys, like the EIB one, consistently show a few major things. Finding skilled staff is a big one, high energy costs, access to finance, as we discussed, and deficits in infrastructure.
Okay, finally, let's bring it right down to the citizens of Europe. All these economic factors, productivity, institutions.
Yeah.
How does it all actually affect people's lives?
Well, fundamentally, strong productivity growth is what underpins a higher standard of living for everyone. Simple as that.
More productive economy, more prosperity to share around.
Basically, yes. And for citizens right now, these big transitions, digital, green, they mean the job market is changing fast.
So people need to adapt, learn new skills.
Absolutely. Lifelong learning is becoming essential. The European Skills Agenda talks about this. We need to tackle skill shortages and also skill mismatches, people having skills that aren't quite what employers need.
Yeah.
And those demographic shifts we mentioned, aging workforce, that directly impacts citizens too. It highlights why we need more people working and why integrating migrants effectively into the labor market is so important. Dealing with issues like migrants being overqualified for jobs they can get is part of that.
In infrastructure, that feels very direct.
It is. The quality of your transport roads, trains, and your digital connection, fast internet, reliable mobile service that directly impacts your quality of life, your connectivity.
Better train connections across borders, for instance. more sustainable option.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of thing makes a real difference. And energy costs and security, too. A fragmented energy grid can mean higher bills for you, the consumer. A more unified European energy market should help with price stability and, keeping the lights on.
So it sounds like for any of these big structural reforms to actually work, they need buy-in from people,
Oh,
social acceptance.
precisely. That's absolutely essential. Regulations need to find that tricky balance, protecting the public interest, obviously, but not stifling the innovation and investment that ultimately drive improvements in living standards for everyone.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
it feels clear that Europe faces some pretty significant challenges. Competitiveness, innovation, growth.
Yep. Big challenges, but hopefully addressable ones.
And they all seem interconnected, linking back to productivity, how effective our institutions are, the quality of our infrastructure.
Yes, and the message coming through loud and clear from all these reports is the need for, well, urgent and concrete structural reforms.
Not just tinkering around the edges.
No, real reforms, both at the national level and the EU level, targeting regulatory efficiency, governance skills, infrastructure, the whole package.
And it's so important, isn't it, to remember all those different perspectives we talked about. The EU view, the national view, the business view, and crucially, the citizen's view.
Absolutely. Tackling these challenges effectively means considering all of them. It's about building a Europe that's not just more competitive and innovative, but also fundamentally more prosperous and optimistic for everyone living here.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener.
Considering everything we've discussed, if you had to pick just one single structural reform implemented at the EU level, what do you think would have the biggest positive impact on the daily lives, the future prospects of European citizens?
Yeah. What's the one big lever to pull? Definitely something to mull over.